Good evening. Good evening, everybody. I'm David Harvey. I'm president of Rice Design Alliance. And on behalf of RDA, I welcome you to the first lecture of our fall series, Chinese Architecture, which is made possible by a grant from the National Endowment of the Arts and in collaboration with the Rice School of Architecture, the Dallas Architectural Forum, the UT Austin School of Architecture, the Chow Center for Asian Studies, and the Transnational China Project at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. We are grateful to the Museum of Fine Arts Houston for the use of this wonderful auditorium, and we'd like to thank them for their continued support of all of our programs. We also want to thank the Rice School of Architecture and Dean Sarah Whiting for their continued support of our organization and mission. My company, D. Harvey Builders, sponsored tonight's pre-lecture reception. I hope you came early and enjoyed it. Please note the list of our sponsors on the screen that have made this event possible, and join me in thanking them. And as a courtesy to our speaker, please silence your cell phones and do not use flash photography. Tonight we will have a book signing after the lecture just outside the auditorium, where Thomas Campanella's publication, The Concrete Dragon, will be for sale. This series will continue through October 19th, and each of the lectures will be traveling to Dallas and then to Austin. On Saturday, November 12th, the RDA Annual Gala will honor the Woodlands. This important fundraising event helps fund our RDA programs and Site Magazine. For information on all of the RDA's future programs, please see the RDA website at www.ricedesignalliance.org. And now I would like to introduce Stephen Lewis, who is a professor in practice and associate director of the Chow Center for Asian Studies at Rice. His research explores the influence of media in new public spaces in Asian cities and the development of privatization experiments, energy policy, and central local government fiscal relations in China and other transitional economies. And in addition to that, Stephen has been instrumental in putting this series together. Stephen.
Thank you, David. About 10 years ago, I stood in this exact same spot and looked out at an audience, and they'd asked me to come over and talk about our research about China's changing visual culture. So I gave a nice long talk about our studies of advertisements and how Chinese culture was opening up to the outside world, and all the literature and film and poetry were all changing because China was deciding it really wanted to engage the world and create a global Chinese culture. And throughout the whole lecture, somebody here like David sat through the front row, another nicely dressed man, and sitting, listening and nodding attentively and attentively. So finally I finished my lecture and I look over and I think, all right, does anybody have a question? I look over and I said, he's got to have a good question. He was so engaged. And he raises his hand and he goes, yes, you've been talking about culture and everything, but can you tell us about the Chinese oil and gas companies? And I think that's a Houston element here that we can't set aside. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to say just a few words about the importance of this lecture series and to introduce our distinguished speaker, Thomas Campanella. And the lecture series, we feel, could not be more timely because we here in Houston and in Texas need to pay particularly close attention to what is going on in Chinese cities today. When I first came to Houston in 1996 to teach at Rice University and look at the ways that China is opening up to the outside world, we had very few partners who were interested either on the Chinese side or here in Houston who were interested in exploring Chinese cities in particular. This is, however, was before Yao Ming. Now when I go to China, I don't have to say, Shousedun, I don't have to explain where that is. It's in Texas, it's in the south. I just have to say, we're the city they built around Yao Ming. And people get it. I also now can just reference the fact that here's the space program. This is where America's space program came from. Most Chinese people don't know about the space program and our achievements in the 1960s because China was closed. So they don't think of Houston as a space city until very, very recently. Whereas now, if you talk to people in the tourism industry, they'll tell you about the thousands and tens of thousands of Chinese tourists who are coming into the United States. This is one of their main stops. And in fact, it used to be billed, go see a Rockets game and then go to the Houston Space Center. This is also before the growth of a Chinese middle class and the transnational Chinese middle class and billionaires who are out there changing all the relationships that exist between Houston and China as well. You can go to Chinese cities and look in certain newspapers, and you'll see advertisements for condos and real estate developments here in Houston. They're mainly targeting the parents of Chinese who have come over here, and the parents want to come over and see how the kids are doing, and real estate here is much cheaper than it is in China, so it's a very nice investment. And the US government is being very welcoming towards that in very recent years. What does China mean overall, kind of economically, but to people here in Houston? Overall, about $10 billion. We send about $3 billion a year of goods over to China. They send about $6 billion here coming back. Houston also has an influence in China just as a port in terms of the management of both our ports and also our airport, which the Houston Airport Authority, for example, has been advising Chinese airports on how to privatize and how to become more professional. They've been training people under contract for many years now. This is also before, now I have to come to energy, right? This is also, over the last couple of years, China went from being not very important on the world stage in terms of energy to very recently, China National Offshore Oil Corporation has become one of the major partners working to develop unconventional gas in Texas, down by San Antonio. So now we're in a situation where we have to look at China not just as a competitor, but also as a partner in many ways. And I think the part that's been counterintuitive up until just very recently is looking at Chinese cities and increasingly recognizing that the solutions that are being proposed for solving a lot of the public problems that exist in our cities actually exist in Chinese cities as well. And the Chinese partners over there are going to be the people that we will be following. And there are many scholars at Rice University, for example, and U of H and St. Thomas, who are taking up new research projects with new research partners, all kinds of policy think tanks. And what we're all looking at is, if it works in Chinese cities, can it work over here as well? Because then you also have very, very powerful economies of scale, combining the world's two largest markets. So could not be a more timely time to talk about all these. Our speaker tonight is prepared to share his own unique and invaluable insights into how urbanization and urbanism in China are very much related to how we as Texans are going to be living in Houston and other cities in the future. Thomas Campanella, he's Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Design at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome. He holds a master's degree in landscape architecture from Cornell University and a PhD in urban planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's a recipient of the Guggenheim and Fulbright Fellowships, and he's held teaching and visiting appointments at MIT, the Harvard Graduate School of Design, Columbia University, and Chinese University of Hong Kong. His books include The Concrete Dragon, China's Urban Revolution, What It Means for the World, the book that David mentioned, and one which I very, very highly recommend. It came out just a couple of years ago, and I would consider it one of the best works out there, looking at how China's cities are rapidly evolving. And I got the chance to talk to Thomas beforehand and say, I'm very jealous of this, how you managed to write this book, which is so authoritative, not being a kind of a classically trained sinologist. I said, how did you manage to do it and get all these amazing interviews with local leaders? And I was relieved to tell me that it took him 10, 20 years, something like this. He started off a long time, 10 years. Okay, only 10 years, only 10 years. So it's obviously a major work that he's prepared to share some of the insights with us this evening. He's also published Republic of Shade, New England and the American Elm, which is the winner of the Spiro Kostoff Award from the Society of Architectural Historians, and also Cities from the Sky, an aerial portrait of America. He has also published in frequent contributor to Metropolis, Places, The Wall Street Journal, Wired, Architectural Record, and other periodicals. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Thomas Campanella.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, David. And thanks to the Rice Design Alliance for bringing me to Texas here for a few days and giving me a chance to relive the summer of 2011 again, briefly. In the spring of 1992, Deng Xiaoping retired and nearly 90, but still the most powerful man in China, made a Lunar New Year tour of southern China that culminated in a visit to the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone. Hard on the Hong Kong border, Shenzhen had been set up by Deng a decade earlier as a kind of experimental garden for foreign investment and free market capitalism, and it had already by this time grown mightily. In 1979, around the time this photo was taken of Deng Xiaoping here in Texas, Shenzhen was an agricultural town of about 68,000 people, roughly the population of Chapel Hill today. By 1992, it had already grown to about 3 million, right? And this was really just the start. Shenzhen today actually has a population almost equal to that of New York City. Deng visited Shenzhen in 1992, not as an idle vacationer, but to spur on the economic reforms he launched in 1979, but that were now on the verge of being rolled back by the hardliners in Beijing, who, ironically enough, saw Deng not as the, quote, butcher of Tiananmen, but as a laissez-faire loose cannon whose open-door liberalizations had encouraged the Beijing Spring in the first place. Deng's trip was hauntingly reminiscent of the Nanxun, or Southern inspection tours, undertaken 300 years before by the Qing Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty emperors, right, to consolidate their realm, and it had a remarkable effect. Deng was hailed by the people as a kind of returning god of prosperity. And it was on this trip that he reportedly uttered the famous words, "To get rich is glorious." Though, in fact, he never said that. But he might as well have, right? He never put it that quite in those words, but he might as well have. Because in the wake of this visit, this Nanxun, this southern inspection journey, China's economy roared again to life, unleashing in its wake the greatest building boom the world has ever seen. There's a popular Chinese song from 1992, The Story of Springtime, that celebrates this historical moment well. It was a standard, I'm sure some of you know this song, it was a standard on the karaoke circuit in China for many years, and recorded by a People's Liberation Army vocalist named Deng Wenhua, who you see here, who belts out the lyrics against this soaring backdrop that's very reminiscent of a Maoist anthem, right? In fact, it's an anthem to Deng Xiaoping, and I'll just read you a few lines. I'm not going to sing it, but I will read a few lines for you here. In the spring of 1979, an old man drew a circle on the southern coast of China, and city after city rose up like fairy tales, and mountains of gold gathered like a miracle. I was fortunate to have first visited China just a few months after Deng's Nanxun, this southern visit to Shenzhen, when those cities were rising everywhere you looked. I was actually part of a group of MIT students heading to Beijing for an urban design studio at Tsinghua University. Our first stop was Shenzhen, where our hosts took us to the same rotating restaurant that Deng had himself been taken to and dined. In fact, you can see him up in that upper left image there. This restaurant sits atop the Shenzhen World Trade Center, which was really China's first skyscraper in the post-Mao era. It's a building of immense historical value, really the ground zero, or the axis mundi of this great Chinese building boom. It was built so fast. This is the topping out ceremony in I think 1986. It was built so fast that it set what was known for years as Shenzhen speed, right? And that meant a finished floor every 3 days. That was beaten not much longer, not too much longer after this, but that stood for a long time, Shenzhen speed. Of course, today this building is really an outmoded relic, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's replaced any day now with a 100-story tower. I want to read here just a brief passage from my book, The Concrete Dragon, recalling this visit. By the time we sat down to eat, most of us had been awed into silence. We had stolen a glimpse into the birth chamber of a new age. As the restaurant moved steadily through its orbit, it revealed scenes worthy of a Ridley Scott film. Bright red, upturned earth was being hauled and piled at hundreds of construction sites. Larval buildings rose all around, each wrapped in a cocoon-like husk of bamboo scaffolding. In the middle distance, clusters of new buildings were etched against a pastoral scene of oxen and rice paddies, unchanged for perhaps 1,000 years. Further away on the horizon, mountains bore bright quarry scars, where slopes were literally being blown apart to provide fill for lowland building sites. The explosions reverberated across the landscape all day and often well into the night. That trip proved transformative because until then, I, like many Americans, frankly knew nothing about China and was rather content in my ignorance to keep it boxed and pigeonholed in some small corner of my reality. But here now was an urban revolution unlike anything I had studied, that had already compressed a century's worth of urban transformation into a decade. And over the years I would return, awestruck again and again, to witness the arrival of this brave new urban world. A world that by its sheer scale and speed seems to challenge everything we know about architecture, infrastructure, and urban development. That forces us to recalibrate, if you will, all the instruments we've long used to understand and measure the growth of cities. Put more bluntly, China's urban revolution sails clear off the charts of Western experience. It's like contemplating the speed of light or the scale of the universe. And even that greatest of American builders, Robert Moses, is dwarfed to insignificance by the immensity of Chinese ambition. How does one register, for example, the fact that in the 1990s, the number of rural Chinese residents flocking to the coastal cities annually was greater than 100 years of European immigration to America from 1850 to 1950. That by 2025, another 350 million people will be added to China's urban population, more than the entire population of the United States. How does one fathom the fact that Shanghai had but a single modern high-rise tower in the 1980s, yet today boasts twice as many as New York City? That 900 million square feet of office space were added to that city in the 1990s, equal in floor area to 138 pentagons or 134 I'm sorry, 334 Empire State Buildings. That Beijing's new scratch-built CBD, Central Business District, could accommodate all the office space in the city of Boston or the entire Baltimore metropolitan area. Needless to say, none of this has come without immense social and environmental costs. This was the last old neighborhood in downtown, in the center of Nanjing, demolished around 2006. It's right across the street from Nanjing University. Beijing has largely obliterated its historic city fabric, pushing millions to the urban fringe. Air quality has plummeted. Water resources are under siege. In just the first 4 months of 2010, some 248,000 new cars were registered in Beijing, an average of about 15,500 a week. And just that year alone, as many new cars were added to the Chinese capital as the total number of automobiles in Dallas. Urban sprawl in China has consumed arable land equal in area to New England, compromising China's very ability to feed itself and calling to mind the parable of Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, where profligate sons barter away the land that has sustained this family for 3 generations. But China is also a nation that has lifted millions out of poverty, that has built more miles of subway and high-speed rail than the rest of the world combined, that is now investing more than any other nation in clean energy research and development, that will build, this year alone, 10 million units of affordable housing. Even if we scale that figure to American terms, adjusting that 10 million proportionally to the US population, we still get 2.4 million units. That's 12 times the size of the New York City Housing Authority, twice the entire stock of public housing in the United States, or put another way, enough homes to house a quarter of Texas. And driving all this is not just need, but ambition. Ambition of a titanic sort that the world has not seen since America gave it a good shake in the 20th century. Ambition, a great collective yearning to make the world sit up and take notice, helps explain why China is now home to the largest shopping malls on Earth, the longest bridges and tunnels, half the world's 10 tallest skyscrapers. It is why China now boasts the world's largest airport, the biggest gated communities, the largest automobile showrooms. This one is in Hangzhou. The longest buses, the fastest trains, the biggest hydroelectric dam, and the most expansive theme parks, the world's largest Buddhas even. This is in one of those expansive theme parks in Wuxi. And even the world's biggest skateboard park. And just last year, as you all know, or maybe many of you have been there, the largest World's Fair ever staged. Right, whose theme, appropriately enough, was Better City, Better Life. This scene of the Lujiazui district of Pudong, viewed from old Shanghai across the Huangpu River, is arguably the paramount symbol of China's urban revolution and its surging national ambition. This is one of the most photographed skylines in the world. It has provided, appropriately enough, the backdrop for a number of films seeking a futuristic scene. It's also high political drama. The towers of Pudong and those of old Shanghai across the river in Puxi, which you see down at the bottom, those buildings along the river that are lighted, are locked in one of the world's great urban architectural standoffs, like two men facing one another in a duel, except here the confrontation is between East and West, past and future, old and new. Along the Bund, on the west bank of the Huangpu, stand the old stone edifices of Shanghai's treaty port past, banks and custom houses, stock exchanges, and so forth. It may be an exaggeration to say that these buildings were built with drug money, but not by too much. Certainly, they were part of the extractive machinery that spirited off much of China's wealth to the West for more than a century. By the 1930s, when most of the buildings you see here were built, China had been reduced to a second-class citizen in its own land. And Shanghai's Chinese population was confined to a ghetto within the old walled city of Shanghai. On old British maps, it's even labeled Chinatown as a truly extraordinary thing. To treaty port Westerners, of course, this stone row was a source of great pride. The Shanghai elite would often take visitors to town on twilight excursions to Pudong across the way to revel at this glowing skyline across the river. There's remarkable historical symmetry here because now it's the Chinese who show off with even greater pride across that same river, and not without a little revanchous glee, the rising stacks of steel and glass across the way at Pudong. It doesn't require too much imagination to see this architectural pileup as a kind of collective middle finger raised to the West. Or sword, as the case may be. This is the poster from the film Ultraviolet from several years ago. The old buildings have all been carefully preserved for the tourists, but it seems that their real purpose now is simply to be puny, to be rendered small and insignificant next to the mighty Chinese city rising at Pudong. This skyline has, for Americans, perhaps an even more forceful set of connotations. I have walked the promenade along the Huangpu here many times, and the spectacle across the way still stirs in me a complex array of emotions, feelings of both awe and envy, fear and admiration. It stirs, more than anything, a palpable sense that the Klieg lights of history have shifted before my eyes. And I have been struck, especially by the many parallels between my reactions and those of Europeans a century ago beholding for the first time from a ship in New York Harbor the skyline of Lower Manhattan. They saw in those stacked towers the future itself. And this was deeply unsettling. For this was a future no longer authored by Europe, but by this brash and boorish startup called America. In his 1907 masterpiece, The American Scene, Henry James writes about just such an experience. He had just concluded a 20-year hiatus in Europe and came home to New York to discover a world he barely recognized. He described the Manhattan skyline as fractured by, and I quote, multitudinous skyscrapers standing up to the view like extravagant pins in a cushion already overplanted. And he would spend the rest of his life trying to reconcile and accept the tectonic metamorphosis that those skyscrapers represented. That was at the dawn of the American century. The United States was then the strapping youth among nations, the enfant terrible that had the world by the tail. Europe was old and ossified and cluttered with ruins, a place burdened, as William Tudor put it, by, and I quote, baronial oppression, feudal slavery, and monkish delusions, unquote. America, on the other hand, was the place of fresh starts, the immigrant's dream, the fountain of youth, the city upon the hill. To Ralph Waldo Emerson, the United States was, and I quote, the country of the future, of beginnings, of projects, of vast designs and expectations. And the greatest of those projects was bringing order to the land itself, measuring out towns with Enlightenment precision and building cities. At New Haven, at Boston, Philadelphia, Savannah, westward to the Pacific. Little heed was paid, of course, to those who stood in the way. The narrow huts of the Indians have been removed, wrote John Adams approvingly in a 1656 diary entry, and in their room have arisen fair and lofty edifices, large and well-compacted cities. By the end of the 19th century, those well-compacted cities were rising faster and taller than any in history. Europeans watched in awe as red brick Boston spread about Beacon Hill, as Chicago rose from the plains, then burned to the ground, only to rise again stronger and taller, inventing the skyscraper along the way and celebrating its triumphal resurgence with the Columbian Exposition of 1893, still among the greatest fairs ever staged. Make no little plans, its creator, Daniel Burnham, later exhorted, as many of you know, they have no magic to stir men's blood. The zenith of American urban ambition was New York circa 1935. This was a time of enormous hope and possibility, even in the face of an economic crisis that makes our own current mess pale in comparison. The Depression threw millions out of work, yet we erected the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, Rockefeller Center. With the aid of the New Deal, we planned and built public works that New York still runs on today. Airports and tunnels and bridges, scores of new parks and playgrounds, more than 100 miles of parkway. These are drawings from the book that I'm working on now about Clark and Rappuano in the Moses era. And as the 1930s drew to a close, New York, like Chicago earlier, celebrated its faith in the future with another great American expo, the 1939 New York World's Fair. These are the early drawings of the site plan. The world of tomorrow was its slogan, and until Shanghai last year, it was actually physically the largest fair ever staged. But the Trojan horse was already within the gates. Trojan egg might actually be a more accurate term, for it was inside Wallace Harrison's Perisphere. This was the centerpiece of the 39 fair, the Trilon and the Perisphere. Inside Harrison's Perisphere was where millions of Americans first glimpsed a compelling vision of what a post-urban, freeway-laced, mass-motoring America might look like. And this was, of course, the Futurama exhibit, a great automated diorama of the American landscape circa 1960, designed by Norman Bel Geddes and built by General Motors. This was the most popular exhibit at the fair. People lined up for hours to see it. In fact, Americans hardly needed Futurama to know where they wanted to go. Henry Ford's little spaceship was already urging Americans to scatter thinly upon the land, even in the 1920s. And as this photo suggests, we were already well down the garden path of automobile dependency by 1939-1940. This is the parking lot at the 1939 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows Park. Of course, the automobile really only activated a deep-rooted set of latent yearnings here. For Americans have always been reluctant urbanists, ambivalent about the moral value of cities, and infatuated with what Leo Marx termed the middle landscape, that mythified pastoral space halfway between wilderness and the city that every suburban home attempts in some ways to reconstitute. Anti-urbanism is a perennial theme throughout American history and literature and politics, going all the way back to the founding generation. Even as he cheered America's well-compacted cities, John Adams worried about those, and I quote, contagions of madness and folly, which are seen in countries where large numbers live in small spaces. And of course, Thomas Jefferson very famously opined in his Notes on Virginia that, and I quote, the mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government as do sores to the strength of the human body. And so, equipped now with a real means to escape the urban gravity field, and encouraged to do so, I'll add, by a variety of federal policy, Americans in the post-war era abandoned the city in droves, taking tax dollars with them to the suburbs and setting into motion a cycle of urban shrinkage and decline that continues even up to today. What we did, in effect, was scuttle what urban ambition we had for the shallow succor of suburbia. We gave up on density, on living together, on urban community and civitas. The city upon the hill was sacrificed for the suburb upon the plains. And as you all well know, the social and environmental and political costs of that decision have been tremendous and will take decades of hard work to reverse. This is, of course, no city upon the hill, right? It is preening, stage-set urbanism of the very worst sort. But it also symbolizes a commitment to urbanism and to city-making in China that we have not seen in this country for 75 years. And so this is a bittersweet vista of sorts, one that stands as an indictment, a reminder of our lost American faith in the urban. What makes it all the more bittersweet is that the skyscraper itself, and therefore this and all such skylines, bears that Chicagoland pedigree. And ironically, one of the tallest buildings here, the Jin Mao Tower, which you see here, Jin Mao, I may not be pronouncing that. My wife tells me that I always call it the Gold Cat Building, which is not right. The Golden Cat Building, if you don't get the tones right. Anyway, it's not the Golden Cat Building. That was designed by the Chicago office of SOM. In fact, the architect was a Chicago native and Texas-educated a fellow named Adrian Smith. Only a short walk from the riverfront here in Shanghai is perhaps even more eloquent testament to China's great faith in cities. This is the Shanghai Urban Planning Exposition Center, which I'm sure many of you have been to. 5 floors of enthusiasm for all things urban, including on the 2nd or 3rd floor, this incredible model of the Shanghai that is and will be. And what an exalted place in the city City Planning Center occupies. It sits right alongside City Hall, right? This is Charpentier's Shanghai Opera House building. This is the great art museum in the city. This is really, it sits right at the center of the city here, like a chalice on this great urban altar. Beijing has an even larger facility, Urban Planning Expo Center, that's right off Tiananmen Square. Imagine, as I often ask my students, equivalent temples of urbanism in the United States. This is what happens when I play with Photoshop too long. This is, yeah, you get the point. Difficult indeed to imagine. Le Corbusier famously observed that to send a young architect to Rome was to ruin him for life. I think much the same could be said about sending a middle-aged American urbanist to China. For to visit China today is to see ourselves as we once were, youthful, reckless, daring, determined to shake the world. It is to understand that we Americans have entered a kind of tweedy middle age, that a century of power and wealth and sprawl has dulled and softened us. It is to realize that we no longer yearn to build on an epic scale, to reach for the stars or claim the moon. To visit China today is to know that now it is we who have become the old world. How ironic that China, that most ancient of civilizations and long the, quote, sick man of Asia, would beat us at a game we defined for generations, of building big, of making no little plans. 60 years ago, a Nebraska senator named Kenneth Spicer Weary made a charity trip to Shanghai, where he declared to his Chinese hosts, and I quote, "With God's help, we will lift Shanghai up and up, ever up, until it is just like Kansas City." It is now we who might do well to learn a thing or two from China's playbook. For today, it sometimes seems we have a hard time building anything at all here in the United States. And this makes it hard not to regard China with envy green eyes, to marvel at its uncanny ability to get things done. And this is magnified by a keen awareness that our looming national infrastructure crisis, our seeming inability to lay in the physical infrastructure to carry us forward, has vast and troubling implications for the very competitiveness, economic viability, and even security of the United States in coming decades. Back in 1933, at the lowest point of the Great Depression, it took Americans just 3 years to build the bridge you see here, the Oakland Bay Bridge. 50 years later, in the 1980s, it took 3 years to build just a new set of toll booths for the bridge. And today, much of the bridge, not all of it, but much of the new replacement Bay Bridge was not even made in the United States, but in China, as a series of 24 enormous steel modules that were manufactured and shipped over from China. What does it say about a nation that cannot rebuild the very infrastructure that our grandparents built 75 years ago with half our wealth and twice our depression? Or that took 7 years to build this little footbridge over the Durham Freeway in the Research Triangle? 7 years. My wife, who happens to be Chinese and an architect, was bowled over by this. Right? But Americans put a man on the moon, she said. 7 years to build a little bridge? 7 years in China means entire new cities built from scratch. It will mean 7 years from now, the most extensive national high-speed rail system on Earth. Already, Chinese trains are the fastest in the world, topping out at over 200 miles an hour. Very soon you will be able to travel by train from Shanghai to Beijing in a mere 4 hours. When I first, it was a 20-hour train ride when I first visited China. Service like this in the United States would mean Boston to New York or Houston to Dallas in little over an hour. Of course, there are immense equity and justice and environmental issues with the way cities are made in China today. People are shunted around like so many scared sheep, evicted with only a few weeks' notice. Those who protest are silenced quickly and often violently. It's easy, in the end, to be seduced by the peaks and spires of that Pudong skyline, by all the glam and shine, and forget that more people lost their homes to redevelopment projects in Shanghai in the 1990s alone, in just Shanghai in the 1990s, than in 30 years of urban renewal in the United States. To forget that site preparation for the Shanghai World Expo itself, for Better City, Better Life, required evicting at least 18,000 people from their homes, and probably much more than that. This, by the way, is a Hutong neighborhood in Beijing that was being demolished. I took this in 2005. Those characters are basically pleading to the neighbors. The son or daughter of this family, of this woman who's still there, wrote that, asking them to keep an eye on their aging parents. I am certainly not advocating that we develop or adopt a China-style, ruthless, authoritarian approach to urban development here in the United States. There were very good reasons why, back in the 1960s, Americans put all sorts of controls and limits on the development process. Too many ill-conceived highways were rammed through cities. Too many neighborhoods, including my own mother's neighborhood in downtown Brooklyn, were sacrificed to ill-conceived urban renewal schemes. Were it not for Jane Jacobs and the grassroots participatory planning revolution, or the anti-highway and preservation and environmental movements, much more indeed would have been lost. We may be in tweedy middle age, but we are older and wiser for it. But in many ways, the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction. Many of the checks and balances established in the 1970s to slow the urban renewal juggernaut, to give voice to citizens in the planning process to protect natural resources, the environment, have themselves swollen to the point that they often limit even our ability to get essential, smart, socially responsible, environmentally sustainable projects built. The solar and wind farms, the commuter and high-speed rail lines, the dense, walkable, public transit-focused communities. The problem child of participatory planning, the snake in the grass roots, if you will, is the NIMBY, the citizen who effectively weaponizes Jane Jacobs to oppose anything that threatens the status quo, including projects that would reduce our carbon footprint, create more affordable housing, shelter the homeless. Let me be clear here. NIMBYism is a vigilant guard dog that has stopped many a bad project in its tracks. But it's also a force that, for example, in Orange County, home to UNC, Chapel Hill, has terminated proposed downtown infill projects, thus driving development to greenfield sites. That's made the Orange County homeless shelter homeless itself. That's ended a proposed Habitat for Humanity housing complex in Chapel Hill, that's generated strong opposition to much-needed transit-oriented development in the county seat of Hillsborough, where I live. In each of these cases, immediate local concerns trumped long-term benefits to society, environment, and environment at large. Am I suggesting that we roll back environmental controls or the participatory planning process? No. But we need to find a new equilibrium, a kind of happy middle space between the American gavel and the Chinese sledgehammer, between the cautious and measured process of placemaking in the United States and China's extraordinarily able but often reckless will to build. If we in the United States are to build the infrastructure we'll need to make it in the 21st century, we are going to need a good bit of the China-style sledgehammer. And China, for its part, needs just as desperately the gavel of democratic process. China has earned the admiration of the world by creating, almost overnight, the hardware for a better tomorrow. The real challenge now is to develop the software to match that more messy and elusive infrastructure of civil law and transparency, of social equity and justice and civil rights that in the end is the real mark of civilization. Thank you. Yeah, I'll take some questions if anyone has any. Yeah.
That was a great talk, and I appreciate the context of politics at the end, but you didn't touch on the context of economics, different economic structures of the two countries, and I wonder if you could sort of add that into your caveat of the comparison. Because in the end, Europe to New York is very different than New York to China because of the different economic models.
Well, but in a way, what China, I'm not following your question precisely. What China has adopted since, well, Deng Xiaoping was responsible for this, was basically putting China on a capitalist free market path. So it's basically unleashed, a generation's worth, more than a generation's worth of pent up entrepreneurial yearning. Right.
So it's a
centralized.
It's a capitalist model that
Right.
operates very differently.
Right.
And I think leads to what looks like it could be an American city,
Right.
testosterone, but actually has I think, other. It's
Yeah.
not just the politics,
Sure.
of course, but the economics
Yeah.
allow for that.
Right, that's right. And also, the central government is pouring enormous sums of money into into encouraging and often building these places. Maybe not the skyscrapers themselves, although in some cases that too. But certainly a lot of the other elements of the cities, the great new plazas and parks that are being built. And there's a certain degree of showmanship and competition between these cities that is going on as well. Yeah, you're right. That's a whole nother lecture that I'm probably not that expert on, being not an economist. Yeah, back there.
How does the very humanitarian philosophy of Confucius reconcile itself with what's going on in China today?
That's a good question. I think it has been co-opted in many ways by the government to sort of underscore or sanction a lot of the kind of development we're seeing there. I'm not really sure how to answer that. That's the whole Confucian ethic is one that certainly undergirds Chinese society in many ways, not unlike the way the Calvinist ethic did in the United States in the past. But I also think it's amplified or exaggerated a bit by the government to control the society in some ways. Yeah.
It seems like in places
Pudong, a lot of the open space, parks and plazas, are really designed as decoration in front of buildings rather than places for people to gather.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious on your thoughts on the role of public open space in Chinese cities and how that's changing.
You're right about that. The Pudong was actually in many ways designed to work best from an aerial view, or from at least the view from those skyscrapers looking down. I write about this in the book. The scale of the place is really enormous. It's not a human scaled environment. It's very different from Puxi, which is the old part of Shanghai in that sense. And there you really see these enormous open spaces, the Century Boulevard, the great the avenue that runs as a kind of armature through Pudong. I think it's called Century Park, the main central park there. These are the scale of these projects again is often motivated primarily by this drive to create something that is a kind of boasting point vis-a-vis Beijing, especially. The competition between Beijing and Shanghai is a very fierce one. They are not designed with the public in mind as a primary user, although they are used very well, because if for no other reason, you've got the densities that will sustain the use of these parks, or will encourage people to use them. But I've noticed, and I haven't been to the Central Park in Pudong for a couple of years now, but Pudong is the Central Park, Lujiazui, that iconic sort of skyline I showed, there's not an enormous amount of residential development there, right? It's really like the financial district. So the open spaces right in the center are not that heavily used, except during festivals and holidays. One other question back there, yeah.
I come from Shanghai, and I have studied in Beijing for 4 years. So I'm just wondering, how do you look at the quality of the infrastructure that have been built in both of the cities? Because I know just a few days ago, the subway
Right.
in Shanghai crashed, and there were a lot of people hurt.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Also in Beijing about the lifter problem there. So
Right, and then there was the recent accident on the high-speed line. Yeah, the quality of construction has bedeviled. You know, when you're building at this pace, it's inevitable that you're going to do things shoddily, and it's certainly the case in China. The life cycle of a lot of these buildings and infrastructure projects is actually is remarkably short. There are buildings that were, new buildings in the early 90s that have already been, in fact, that's quite common to see buildings from the late 80s, early 90s being replaced, partly because the real estate values will bear that out, but also because the construction quality is very low. I noticed also at the Pudong, the airport, the terminal buildings at the Pudong airport. I was shocked to see them. They were only about maybe 8 years old at the time, and they looked like 20 or 30-year-old buildings. So that is a problem that will loom increasingly in coming years. Thank you again.